Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we've been getting into doing some Bible decodes. This is Bible decode number 122, and this is within the overall realm of the Flavian signature and also under the Reciprocal Church. We're trying to put together spiritual resources for you to use in your own life that will help you as all of the Western religions come crashing down from the lack of evidence. Just like everything else, we're going to discover that everything that we've been told is wrong. And so we're trying to put together things that you can trust, because you can verify them. They have equations connected with them, and you can experience them and try them on for size. But the Bible decodes are really for to bring us to that point where we can put in some of these reciprocal church aspects. And we're looking at the Flavian signature approach, which is that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars, in particular the Caesars from the Flavian dynasty. That includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperor Titus and Emperor Domitian, and they ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. They wrote the Gospels as a piece of wartime propaganda, or shortly after the war propaganda against the Jews, to try to get the Jews to mellow out, because the Jews had been revolting from the Romans for over a century. One uprising after revolution, after war, after insurrection. And the most recent was the War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD, in which both General Vespasian and General Titus were in charge of the siege of Jerusalem, and both were injured in the war. And the Romans were well known for using psychological warfare and psychological operations, particularly in terms of creating religions. And so they also knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. But the Jews were waiting for a Messiah who was a military general, who was going to help them kick the Romans out of Jerusalem and Judea in general. And they actually did that under the zealots named Eleazar, John, and Simon. And they kicked the Romans out of Jerusalem in 66 AD. That brought Emperor Nero of Rome to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And that was the beginning of the War of the Jews. So what Titus and Vespasian, and certainly others, whoever their intellectuals at that court, the court of the Caesars, and other relatives of theirs, and so on, what they did is they wrote a story, and they backdated it by 40 years. And then they also wrote the history of the Jewish War, which is a famous book that was written under the name of Josephus. So Josephus wrote the Jewish War, or the War of the Jews. These two books are parallels. They are meant to be read intertextually, meaning being read together. They bounce off each other. They bang off each other. They parallel each other, and they mirror each other. They parody each other, and they were clearly written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And the reason, again, was that the Jews were waiting on a military Messiah. The Romans were afraid there was going to be another revolt. So the Romans decided to create the story of a Jewish savior who was a prince of peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and who believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, and who believed that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and who believed in walking an extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack, and who encouraged his Jewish brothers to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. But at the same time, who went outside the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers, who were Jews, who were attempting to exchange the Roman money that had graven images on them, on the coins, for Jewish money that did not, so that they could bring it into the temple, and who disrupted the commerce of the Jews who were selling doves and pigeons outside the temple to use for the animal sacrifice rituals that were done inside the temple. So in other words, Jesus was disrupting the Jewish way of life at the same time that he was doing a number of pro-Roman things. That should be first red flag. Next red flag is that the New Testament is written in Greek, as is Josephus. This was the language, along with Latin, that was spoken primarily in Rome. It was rare to see somebody speaking Greek in Judea, much less writing it. Now, it was the language of the elite, the Jewish elite, throughout the diaspora, much more so in places like Alexandria and Rome than in Judea. And the third red flag is that the Romans had a monopoly on censorship. They had a monopoly on distribution. They had a monopoly on publishing. There was no way that a bunch of semi-literate, Aramaic-speaking Jewish, followers of Jesus were going to be able to write a gospel, much less 4 gospels, and have it distributed. Much less how many ever there are. There are about 40 of them or something. Most of them are Gnostic. But, so you just add up the information and you pretty much, are like, duh, the Romans obviously wrote the Gospels. That's exactly what the Romans would have done, and that's exactly what they did do. And, most scholars are not willing to go that far and instead pretend like they don't know anything about the Roman origins hypothesis, and instead attribute all of the supernatural stuff in the Gospels to God, when it's much more Occam's razor-ish to attribute it to that the Romans wrote fiction. Both Josephus's War of the Jews and the New Testament are fiction, and they are there for psychological purposes, to mellow out the Jews, and eventually also to mellow out the other Romans, like slaves and soldiers. That was more of the Pauline epistles, are more about mellowing out the Christians. or won't call them Christians, mellow out the Gentiles that were living at Rome, or in the empire. Now, we're looking at the work of Michael Maniscalco, his book, Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And what he does is he digs in with the War of the Jews and the book of Luke. And he looks, digs pretty hard for parallels between the two. And lo and behold, just in the book of Luke, he found over 250 parallels between the two works. And he goes through them in exhaustive detail in this book. And not only does he do that, but he also graphs them out on a chart, which you can see in the thumbnail for this video. And he puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis. He puts War of the Jews by Josephus on the horizontal axis. And every time he finds a parallel, he plots a dot, puts a dot there at the corresponding place on the chart. When he's done with the 250 points, he finds that he has made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, APTVS. Again, Latin, the language of the Roman elite. And what this basically means is that not only did the Romans write the New Testament, in this particular case, the book of Luke, but they literally signed their names to it, APTVS. I believe that stands for Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus. Vespasian a lot of times would use a VS for his name. There are Roman coins out there that say TVS, Titus Vespasian. The chances that something like that would occur are, standard deviations beyond any of your, Q posts and all the 17s that you're all looking for, and where you're saying that, how many coincidences before it's beyond the realm of probability. This is way the hell beyond the realm of probability. If you are, you can quibble about 1 or 2 of the parallels, or 10 or 20 of the parallels, but there are 250 of them. And some of them are powerful, and many of them are very well put together. They're well hidden, woven into the script. Some of them are not. Some of them are simple and just there to put a dot. And some of them he kind of stretches to grasp maybe 1/10 of them. I think he should have just, put those aside. He still would have had the same APTVS pattern. But Christians generally will do everything that they possibly can do to wish this away or to criticize this, but you're just lying to yourself. And the problem is that you can see me as being your enemy for doing this, but it's the Romans that are your enemy. The Romans are mocking you from 2,000 years ago with this. The parallels, the riddles, the puzzles, the codes that are written within this New Testament are insulting, mean-spirited, ridiculing, pornographic, cannibalistic. They are taking every chance they can get to mock you. And you think that they throw out a few, limited hangouts, a little bit of Roman Stoicism and some Neoplatonism and some Egyptian philosophy that talks about, good things. And you kind of rely on those verses ignoring the rest of it that is mostly brutal jokes at your expense. So what we're looking at in Menescott is he's talking here about how he believes that the War of the Jews, which is written in 7 volumes, that probably the first 3 volumes, or at least the first 2 volumes, were written at a later date, and you can tell by the letters. The letters are much less well developed, as are the parallels are much less well developed in the A and the P, as opposed to the T and the V, and especially the V and the S. And so, and then to throw in that 66 AD was the beginning of the Jewish War, and that's about halfway through the paragraphs of the Josephus's War of the Jews. The first half goes back a century and kind of leads up to the Jewish War. So it's very possible that the Jewish War could have been written at one point under Titus or Vespasian, and then maybe a later emperor, perhaps Domitian, or perhaps Arius Piso, who was kind of the shadow emperor under both Titus and Vespasian, that they wrote that at a later date. Okay, so this is where he gets into this evidence. Reasons to think the AP was added later. So the AP of the APTVS pattern. Oddly, the first half of Jewish War, corresponding to the left-hand side of the chart, where A and P are, isn't actually about that war that the title relates to, and the parallels in this region give the impression of being added by someone who didn't have the option of editing Luke to help establish interesting and thematically coherent parodies, because Luke had already been written at the same time that the first half or second half of Jewish War was written. Like Luke, Jewish War was written in Koine Greek, K-O-I-N-E. I don't know how to pronounce that, but Koine Greek, namely the common form of Greek in the period 300 BC to 300 AD. The introduction of Jewish War states that it is the second version, and says that the original version, of which no copy survives, was written in the author's father's tongue, but without saying what this father tongue was. Most scholars think that that means it was written in Chaldee, which is around Sumeria, and is a part of the Jewish diaspora, I guess Babylon and Persia and the Eastern Jews. The problem with this is that linguists agree that the second version of Josephus shows none of the signs you would certainly expect if it were a translation from another language. It apparently claims to be a translation, and this seems to be a lie. If the original corresponded roughly to the second half of the surviving version, then it would be arranged to spell the letters VS, the signature of the father, Vespasian. This points to a solution to our conundrum, namely that this reference to a father tongue is a joke that only those in the senior rank of the secrecy cult would appreciate. Now, he sets this up as a Flavian secrecy cult, meaning that first you start out believing in Jesus, and then you go, it's just like the Masons, different steps of initiation. So at your first step, you see Jesus as a hero. The next step, you see Jesus as the Savior. But then you recognize that Jesus is making all of these prophecies about what's going to happen in the future. And a ton of those prophecies are literally fulfilled by Titus in the Jewish War. And so eventually you get to the point where, well, Jesus is not the Savior, he is the prophet. And he is predicting his second coming. his second coming is Titus. And then finally it's revealed to you that the whole thing about Jesus is a fiction, and that brings you into what he calls pure emperor worship. Okay, in the T of the APTVS pattern, Josephus' story forms a magnificent parody of Jesus, comparable or indeed greater than the way that Jesus' story parodies Titus. So there's a number of different themes of these parallels as we go along. Titus, Jesus' story parodies Titus. What Jesus predicts symbolically comes true literally for Titus in the history war of the Jews. And Jesus has a parallel life with Josephus. They both have very many points. Josephus, the character. Josephus is supposed to be the author of the War of the Jews, but he's also a character in the book because he claims that he was one of the Jewish generals fighting in this war until he surrendered to Vespasian and defected to the Romans. And then there's also a theme that he just got done going through here, that we just got done going through here, about the Passover lamb. And so that also brings in Exodus chapter 12, and it gives you all the steps that you have to follow to do the Passover lamb ritual properly. And then it shows that both in the New Testament and in War of the Jews, those steps are followed to the letter in both of those books. So that's another theme that's involved. However, in the A and the P, the parallels are fewer in number, consistently weaker, reliably less interesting, and overall they look rushed. While they stand out less starkly from the background noise, they are still clearly identifiable. Even in the sole example where a theme is apparent, it only aims to parallel a sentence or two in Luke rather than a corresponding theme running through Luke. Perhaps most tellingly, the parallels, and that's the greatest set of parallels, is what Joseph Atwill calls the Flavian signature, where Jesus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea, and Titus has a 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in War of the Jews in Judea. Jesus' ministry is from 30 to 33 AD. Titus is from 70 to 73 AD. Every place that Jesus goes, Titus goes. In order. They both go to the same places and they have the same experiences. Not literally, but like conceptually or typologically. They have the same kinds of experiences at every place that they go. They go to many, many different places and have many, many different occurrences happen, and they're all parallel with each other, with a great deal of mockery and ridicule mixed in. Anti-Semitic mockery and I guess anti-Christian as well. Perhaps most tellingly, the parallels forming the AP are marked by a lack of hidden riddles and meanings, and there is an increase in the tendency for many locations in Jewish war to parallel a single location in Luke. This suggests that, unlike the parallels forming the T, V, and S, those involved in forming the A and P did not involve Luke being edited at all. Rather, the first half of the surviving version of Jewish war was added after Luke had been published, so as to arrange a series of fairly arbitrary and meaningless metaphorical similarities with it. Even more curiously, The other major work in the name of Flavius Josephus, called the Antiquities of the Jews, retells only the first half of Jewish war in far greater detail, and seems to go out of its way to patch up the weaknesses by contributing information that provides further parallels, or in some cases strengthens the existing ones. Yet, based on the events it describes, Antiquities of the Jews, or the surviving version of it at least, was published during or after Domitian's reign. So yeah, Antiquities of the Jews is supposed to have come out about 20 years after War of the Jews, one in the mid-70s and one in the mid-90s. And Antiquities of the Jews is actually like 20 volumes. And it kind of is more or less is like Josephus's interpretation of the Old Testament. And so there's a lot of speculation that the Antiquities is kind of out there in order to like patch up the weaknesses that the beginning of War of the Jews has, that it was kind of rushed or put together in a way that doesn't show the care that the TVS, the second half of War of the Jews, reflects. Okay, reasons to think the APTVS pattern was built up in more than 2 stages. Most books are created in stages. This one develops the material and thesis found in several of my published articles, but especially my 4th one, which in turn consolidate my 1st and 2nd articles. It isn't contentious to suggest that Jewish war was developed in stages, since its introduction states this. However, I speculate that in its early drafting stages, it originally set out Vespasian's victories in Judea. Now, Vespasian was the general from 66 until 69 AD, and then he became emperor. So then he turned the reins over to Titus. And Titus got to Judea by 70 AD. So Vespasian's victories in Judea, so that Jesus could parallel these. Noting that such parallels would produce a more or less straight diagonal line when plotted, it might have been decided that they could usefully be rearranged to present a V for Vespasian. Some scholars have noted that the last section, called Book 7 of the War of the Jews, gives the impression of being added as an afterthought, and perhaps that decision was made fairly early on to enable the addition of an S when plotted, giving Vespasian standard coinage abbreviation, VS. Okay, so that's important. That is what Vespasian used as standard on his coins, the coins that were minted by the Romans during his reign. He had an imprint of VS. Okay. There is also a division in how the parallels are constructed in the T. The parallels in the VS include Jesus parodying the Flavian victories, the 2 stories evoking Exodus 12, and many more, whilst the T is mainly constructed by making Josephus's story parody Jesus. This suggests that the T, and indeed Josephus's entire story, was the next addition. So perhaps the V and the S came first, and then the T came later. This makes perfect sense because Vespasian was the emperor first, and then Titus became the emperor after that. And maybe he added the T part for Titus, and then the AP part could have been added also later. Either way, I need to flip the page. And this is a funny looking page. We'll see where he goes here. Okay, putting all this information together. How was it done? Let me make sure I'm on the right page here, because it seems like this is a little bit of a skip. Oh, well, this page doesn't have a number on it. That doesn't really help either. Okay, we'll just go from here. Sorry about that. Putting all this information together, how was it done? In the absence of being able to carbon date the manuscript, since we only have copies of copies, I suggest the most likely order of events was as follows. Not to mention that carbon dating is totally not accurate. So, editing process for version 1 of Jewish War during Vespasian's reign. A. Decide to create a religion based on Pauline literature. See, I strongly disagree with that. He contends that the Pauline literature was written earlier than the Gospels, which is what most scholars believe as well. But this is all based on the fact that Paul does not use the Gospels in any of his explanations. And in many cases, he would have benefited from doing so. And so scholars think that Paul must have been written earlier, because otherwise he would have used the Gospels, for evidence. But there is good evidence from both Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin that the Paul material was written later, much later, and that it was written primarily by Pliny the Younger, who was another Roman royal and famous rhetorician, and also the younger foster brother of Arius Piso, who they claim wrote the Gospels and several other books of the New Testament, as well as the Old some in the Old Testament, including the book of Esther, the book of Job, and part of the book of Daniel and part of the book of Isaiah. Okay, during Vespasian's reign, decide to create a religion based on Pauline literature, but secretly paralleling Vespasian's story to reveal him as the second coming. Edit both stories to create a V rather than a diagonal line. So edit both stories to create not just the diagonal line, but both halves of it, so you get a V. To enable faith in Jesus to be later undermined. And then extend the end of Jewish